Hello everyone, this is the fourth of 10 videos I'm doing on retro games. In case you want to check out the previous entries, I've left links on screen and in the description box below. I advise playing A Link to the Past before watching this video, as I will be going in depth on the story and much of the content discussed can only be understood through direct interaction with the game. I'm AesirAesthetics and this is A Link to the Past. In 1990, Nintendo launched the successor to the Nintendo Entertainment System, the aptly named Super Nintendo Entertainment System. 2 years earlier, they had started development on a new entry into the Legend of Zelda series for the original NES. But for the betterment of the game, it was decided to have the team refocus their efforts into releasing it as an SNES game instead. That meant that the team was allowed a lot more creative potential than they had otherwise, and since the series had been selling well up to that point, Nintendo was also able to give the team a larger budget. When it launched, it was hailed a sensation and has consistently ranked as one of the better Legend of Zelda games, often even edging out Ocarina of Time, which in case you're new around these parts is pretty universally accepted to be the greatest game of all time. Unlike most SNES games, A Link to the Past was granted a 1 MB cartridge which effectively doubled the scope of what the team could do with it, and although many ideas like the Final Fantasy inspired party systems were scrapped, the final product didn't suffer from its compromises, as its legacy will back me up on. Unfortunately, however, what constituted as genre-defining and boundary-pushing back in the day tends to become forgotten and undervalued with time, as our perceptions of the medium's limitations and its conventions for quality evolve. Looking back, it'd be easy to say that the Legend of Zelda series was only successful because of Nintendo's name or because it used playground psychology to manipulate its way into pop culture. And while those statements are both true to an extent, they indicate that the series has a lot less merit to it than it does. The Legend of Zelda series is approachable for children and, due to its somewhat covert use of mature themes, is also rewarding for adults to revisit, which is partly why it's had as much staying power in pop culture as it has. When looking back on A Link to the Past, it's important to keep in mind that at this point in its lifespan, this was a relatively young and undersaturated series, and in fact, many of the Zelda staples like the hookshot, the entire musical core of the series, the Master Sword and parallel world mechanic actually originated from this game, which makes it easier to go back to than the previous two entries, but that also invites the somewhat unfair comparison between this game and the sequels. I would easily put this game on par with the best of the series, so bear in mind that there is a definite bias to this analysis, as I knew immediately upon making this video that I thought A Link to the Past still has a lot to teach about game design, and it's unapologetically with that mind frame that I'll be analyzing it. The game starts when Link is awoken by a telepathic message from Princess Zelda. She's been locked in a dungeon in Hyrule Castle, so it's Link's job to hero up and save her. But when Link is about to leave, he's told to stay in bed by his uncle, who leaves for the battle himself shortly after. Since he left, Link is unsupervised, so he decides to ignore his uncle's instruction and proceeds, armed only with a lamp, to the dungeons underneath Hyrule Castle. He arrives through a hidden tunnel, but upon entry he finds his uncle mortally wounded. His uncle is in no shape to save Princess Zelda, and therefore he gives Link his sword and his shield and then teaches him the secret sword technique of their people before seemingly dropping dead. But for Link to save Zelda, he must overcome the threat of the castle guards while simultaneously being bombarded by an amazing score. I mentioned earlier that the musical core of the entire series originated from this game, and it would be a shame to discuss this game without delving a little deeper into the music. Koji Kondo is the video game compositioning, what Shigeru Miyamoto is the game design. And although he might better be likened to John Williams or Danny Elfman, I think my sentiment holds a little more merit as it ascertains to the medium of video games. Koji Kondo has been writing the music of some of the most notable games of all time since the advent of the artistic movement of the late 80s, early 90s. He's been with Nintendo since that time, and it fits into Japan's more corporate style culture where you can get a job with a company and it's expected that you work with them until you quit working. That was actually a large part of what drove Team Silent to this band, as the core team got fed up with the treatment they received at Konami. But Nintendo, seemingly being a more friendly workspace, has managed to hold on to and make great use of some of the most talented individuals in the medium. It was a real boon for them to acquire the creative team it did back in the day, as most of them are still with Nintendo, and because of their loyalty have pushed it to arguably greater heights than any of their immediate competition. Koji Kondo was funnily enough hired while still in his senior year of university and had no classical training in or hardline dedication to music. The 80s were the Wild West of video games, and these sort of careers can't really exist anymore, as the industry has unions and policies that prohibit them, and although they do more good than bad, there's no denying that they do limit the amount of unique talent in favor of a more structured and easily manageable staff. Koji Kondo's first game was the original Punch-Out, but it wouldn't take long for him to be paired with Shigeru Miyamoto, and the two went on to make history together. The main theme of the Legend of Zelda series is one of the most iconic pieces in video games, so it might surprise you to find out that Kondo was commissioned to write it last minute, as the theme Nintendo had originally intended to use wasn't available. As good as the theme is, and much of his later work in the series, in particular Majora's Mask and The Wind Waker, it was with A Link to the Past where I think his talents were truly used to their fullest. Now, I'm not saying that these are the best compositions he ever wrote, but rather that these are the ones that were best utilized. Now, the later games, and much of his other work outside of The Legend of Zelda, has music on par and even surpassing the compositions here, but these are the ones that I never tired of hearing, which is strange seeing as they are essentially always on loop in the background. They do a great job of setting the mood. You can't hear these songs and not be encouraged to adventure. Outside of the flute, A Link to the Past doesn't allow Link to play music himself, so the player might not be as conscious of the music as in the later games, but since this game isn't as dedicated to atmosphere as the sequels would be, that's not really a drawback, and in the sequels, particularly Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, the player is made to interact with practically everything in the game, from geography to characters to the music. But for now, Link is not a musician, so he manages to keep focus and rescue Zelda from her cell. The two then escape to a nearby sanctuary through a secret passage in the sewers. The sanctuary is one of the few instances of censorship in this game, as it wasn't allowed to include any distinct religious symbolism. This does more good than bad, since it allows the sanctuary to act more as a symbol of safety, and removes any premeditated ideas the player might have on any particular religion, which is more important now than back when the game released, as it launched to a generation of children, but is now mostly enjoyed by adults, who might make a bigger deal about that sort of stuff. In Sanctuary, Link learns of Aghanim, his stance as a wizard, his efforts as a usurper, and his aspirations of breaking a seal between the dark and light world, made hundreds of years ago by the Seven Sages. He also learns of Ganon, an evil wizard who invaded the One's sacred realm and used the Triforce to corrupt it to the nightmarish dark world. Aghanim's intentions are to break the seal by sending the descendants of the Seven Sages into the dark world. But all is not lost, as Aghanim can still be defeated by the Master Sword, a legendary weapon forged to combat the forces of evil. But before he can wield it, Link must prove his worth by collecting 3 magic pendants strewn across the land. While obtaining the first pendant, he meets with Sahasrara, who will act more or less as the mentor of the game. The search for the pendants rewards Link with some key items like the bow, Pegasus shoes, and the gauntlets of strength. Link already obtained the lamp and the boomerang earlier on, so it's easy to imagine a rush of excitement from the player as they open up their inventory to find it quickly filling up. The next item of interest is the Master Sword. But before going any further, I want to talk a bit about the structure of the game up until this point. The Legend of Zelda series is notorious for refusing to cave into voice acting, but they do need to deliver their stories somehow, and for over 30 years, they've relied on text boxes. Text boxes are a very interesting subject in and of themselves, especially when they're compared to voice acting. Make no mistake, voice acting is a very unique and extraordinary skill, but they do have some disadvantages to text boxes. For one, they don't attune to the player. Text boxes can be scrolled as fast as the player wants and relies on them being invested enough in the game to follow the story, since reading is dynamic while listening is static. The delivery of voice acting is more fit for movies, as they are a static experience in themselves, and thus the pace and structure of dialogue is better fitted to them, but since games are dynamic, the player is expected to handle much of the pacing themselves, and using voice actors always slows the fast player down and disengages the player from whatever they were doing, as they need to stop engaging and start listening. A Link to the Past using text boxes means that the player had to handle the speed at which they absorbed the story. But it also creates a certain expectation of the game, as the game cannot suddenly take the pacing away from them willy-nilly. A Link to the Past thankfully never does this, and therefore it benefits from allowing the player to take on some of the narrative responsibility themselves. Since I've brought it up, I feel inclined to point out that A Link to the Past does not give the player full control over the speed at which they scroll through the text. Another disadvantage voice acting has to text boxes is one that's all but disappeared, but is very important to bring up when looking to the games of old, and that's storage space. Sound files can take a lot of space, and that means resources that would have otherwise gone into the world or gameplay are siphoned away. It's also important to mention that the sound chip of the SNES wasn't really equipped to handle voices. By utilizing text, the game manages to better use the storage space of the cartridge. And storage space is a very relevant subject when discussing A Link to the Past, but more on that in the Dark World. From waking up and up until reaching the Master Sword, the player has been learning the fundamentals of the game and have had the map ingrained into their heads, and a little later on, that's going to pay off. When they awoke, they opened the chest and went to the castle. The game used a compositioning trick known as leading lines to prod the player in the right direction, and having them look around for an alternative access to the castle taught them to think of the world as one whose systems can be played if you're smart. Sean Velasco of Yacht Club Games put it quite elegantly when he said, "I think what impacted me most with the original Zelda was its item-based progression, and how the items fit into the world structure. It made me see the world as a puzzle just waiting to be solved. Instead of boring locks and keys, it was organic. Every cracked wall, single tile gap across water, or conspicuously placed bush seemed bursting with possibilities." Now he said this in regards to the original Legend of Zelda, but it still applies to A Link to the Past, as that game takes more from it than it does its immediate predecessor. This is a very interesting observation. If a game is a set of rules that intersect and drive the player to a specific action, then the world the game exists within might benefit from being understood and enjoyed more thoroughly by those that master the systems it provides the player with. That means that the story is gameplay driven and is a result of the characters in the world interacting with the systems the world provides. It means that when those characters unbalance the system, it makes sense for the player to have the goal of mastering and rebalancing the system. From the get-go, the player is introduced to the reward loop of chests and the exploration as storytelling hook of the game, and when the player leaves Sanctuary, they're told to look for the Elder in Kakariko Village. They use the world map to find him, only to be told that he's somewhere else. This sends them on a mini-adventure to find him, and familiarizes them with the village and the people of the world, as well as the world itself. The people are quick to give you hints and tell you tales about the world, and that drives the player to want to further explore. The first 3 dungeons are all located on separate ends of the map, so the player has to do at least some exploring to fetch all the pendants. The dungeons follow some basic patterns. There's usually a map, compass, item, and then a boss. The system that drives the exploration of the dungeons in these games is the same one that made Bethesda Studios' entire career, but even Bethesda's efforts lack the nuance and efficiency of Nintendo's. Besides furthering the story and resetting the difficulty curve, the dungeons also serve to contrast the overworld, as they're generally not as bright and a lot more claustrophobic. And they strike an immediate impression. I put it down to the frame and the art style, though this impression might be exclusive to me, as I don't hear it discussed much within Zelda circles. The dungeons are always designed around the retrospective boss fight, so thankfully Nintendo considered replays when designing them. The map and compass to the dungeon are optional items, which means they won't be used by the experienced player and will therefore often be placed in optional rooms, so as to not slow the player down when they're rushing through the game or are simply returning to fight the boss if they lost to it earlier. Something else that might intrigue only me is how the game uses 3D spatial reasoning. I'm always talking about this, but for games to ingrain their worlds in the player's mind, the world must be designed to reward those who think of it in terms of the mechanics of the game, or at least needs to be thought of in deeper sense than where the next cover's at. A Link to the Past is a two-dimensional game, but its dungeons often have several floors, and some puzzle solutions have the player sending blocks down a floor. And this trick, this absolutely arbitrary nothing trick, does so much for the game world. The dungeons don't facilitate as much explorative freedom as the overworld, as they're a lot more goal-oriented. This is some more of that stuff that intrigues me, as the game can be balanced around both player-driven exploration and goal-oriented puzzle solving without changing the gameplay. The Link in these dungeons is the same Link on the overworld cutting grass. And since his movement scheme allows for such a variety in playstyles, he feels real in a way that he might not otherwise. There's something oddly satisfying about cutting grass in these games. Link feels like he belongs in the world he inhabits, and it's another point against those that might consider the game as obsolete because it doesn't have unnecessary camera flaw effects like lens flares or motion blur, or a gritty aesthetic design. Now, if someone were to say the game is simplistic, they'd at least need to concede the point that it uses the simplicity more efficiently than that throwaway statement might suggest. But even so, the game is far from simplistic. Elegant, yes. Simplistic, no. When Link arrives in the Lost Woods, he's made to do a bit of exploring before finding the Master Sword. With it in hand, he's able to combat Aghanim, but he receives a telepathic message from Princess Zelda who tells him that Aghanim's forces are coming for Sanctuary, so Link hurries his way to aid her. But when he arrives, he finds the sage wounded, and he tells Link that Zelda has been taken to the castle. So Link now, with more motivation than ever, makes his way to confront Aghanim, but when he finally faces him, it's too late, as he's just finished sending Zelda to the Dark World. This might be seen as the last straw, as Link immediately goes into combat with him, but is unfortunately not able to harm Aghanim. That is to say, with his own weapons. So Link instead deflects Aghanim's magical attacks back at him and eventually defeats him, but before the last blow can be struck, Link is sent to the Dark World. The Dark World is a marvel of game design, and although the progression the player had to do to reach it might vary a little bit, the story so far is the gist of it. When the player entered the Lost Woods, they were met with fog and a sense of the unnatural events to unfurl. They were then eventually sent back to the castle, and seeing as they've certainly had to use the map quite a bit at this point, are very familiar with the castle as its center. Because they're so familiar with the map, the jump to the Dark World is that much more effective. The Dark World is another example of saving storage space, as it's just a reskinning of the basic layout of the Light World, but it's corrupted. Where there was a desert, there's now a swamp. Where there was a village, there's now a dilapidated town of thieves. Skulls replace pots and stones, and the trees have faces. The player, being familiar with the layout despite not having visited it, makes it uncanny, and the absence of elements they've taken for granted, such as the kind villagers and the bright colors, make them reassess themselves. The jump to the Dark World is an effective means of pulling the rug from under the player and was set up really well. The existence of two worlds would become a staple of the Zelda series, but one thing they never quite captured again was the feeling of alienation, though that is certainly a creative decision and not a blunder by the developers. The Dark World contains 7 to 8 dungeons, depending on how you count, and is where the player will be spending most of their time in the game. The dungeons are all a mix of puzzle solving and combat engagements, and since I brought up the subject earlier, I think it's only fair I delve a little deeper into what I meant by resetting the difficulty curve. Every dungeon is a test of the player's progression. It forces the player to be familiar with a new mechanic, and the boss battle at the end is a final test of their skill with that mechanic. The new mechanic can then be called upon in later dungeons, and some like the hookshot and Titansmith have a lot of use on the overworld as well. By familiarizing the player with new mechanics in each dungeon, the game can make sure that the player now knows that mechanic, and thus all engagements designed afterwards can be designed assuming the player has the know-how to utilize every mechanic available to them. Since the player is always mastering new mechanics, the game can safely increase the skill floor, and with it, the difficulty curve. After being fleeced by this monkey, the player is able to access the first dungeon in the Dark World, the Dark Palace, in which they acquire the hammer before defeating the dungeon boss. Afterwards, they also pick up a health upgrade and meet with the first of the 7 Maidens. She gives Link and the player some exposition and tells them of Ganon's plot. The 7 Maidens are the descendants of the 7 sages, and Ganon intends to use them to open up the barrier made up by their ancestors. But the Maidens have a different idea. Link is told to save the other 6, so that together they can break the barrier to Ganon's hideout, which will enable Link to confront and defeat him once and for all. Up until the last dungeon, Link will undergo a lot of growth as a protagonist and especially as an avatar for the player. In terms of story, there isn't much mandatory for the next few dungeons, so instead the player is expected to complete side quests and further explore. Exploration and immersion yield better items and upgrades, so if any part of the game is too difficult, the player can safely spend an hour in the overworld, and they're sure to find some difficulty release valves like heart containers or late game items. I won't be going through every dungeon in the Dark World in depth, and of the smaller stories of the game, the ones I would like to talk about are the Flute Boy, the Blacksmiths, and the Buck Boy. What I like about the Flute Boy is how his quest ties the light and dark world together. If Link goes to the Haunted Grove in the Dark World, they find the Flute Boy transformed into a tree-like creature, and he tells Link that he buried his flute with some flower seeds in the Light World and asks Link to search for it. He then gives Link a shovel and thus the means to dig the flute back up. When Link does so and returns to the Flute Boy simply says that he can't play it anymore and asks Link to give it to his father, but not before playing it for him. Link does so, which results in the Flute Boy transforming into a tree. From this point on, his spirit can no longer be glimpsed in the Light World. When Link meets the Flute Boy's father in the tavern again, the man explains that he understands what has happened and asks for Link to keep the flute. He then asks if Link will honor his son by playing the flute in the village center and laments that he would have wanted to see his son one last time. The flute is required to complete the game, and obtaining it early is another effective way to speed up your traversal through the world. Many games make the mistake of presenting the player with tools that have no in-game context, and since I mentioned Bethesda earlier, I want to give some credence to the point I made. Where Bethesda used fast travel to kill downtime, Nintendo used it to tell a sad tale about a father and son being separated, and each coming to terms with the fate that awaits them without the other. Note that this video is not intended to discredit Bethesda or talk down on their games, as many of them do really well with what they set out to do. But in order to have a parallel to A Link to the Past, its design and its influence, I felt I needed to pick something that was clearly cut from its cloth. What I like about the Blacksmiths is again how their quest ties the light and dark world together. Had Link not acquired the Moon Pearl in the beginning hours of the game, he would have appeared as a pink bunny when he set out to the Dark World. This is because things take on another form in the Dark World, and the Blacksmiths are an example of storytelling through this obscure mechanic, which lends more credence to it being present. You've probably picked up on this, but I really like when games use characters to humanize abstract mechanics. In film, there is a term known as hanging a lampshade on something. It means to have the characters in the movie point out when very lucky or really convenient things occur. It's a practice that I dislike because it acts on some weird psychological trigger that makes an audience more receptive to bad storytelling. In games, however, there is the tendency to reward players with bonus experience for filling in abstract checklists or including unnecessary upgrade systems, and these never sit right with me either, since they reward the player for something that doesn't really fit into the game. Now, I don't want to say it would absolve developers of the sin of utilizing these out-of-place systems, but were they to use them to tell a story, I would be a lot less harsh on them. That rant is however only applicable to A Link to the Past because it doesn't fall into the pitfall of unnecessary systems. I'm not sure if A Link to the Past stands so well up to scrutiny because it's a marvelously designed game, or if it's because its influence sculpted what modern scrutiny is. Anyway, when Link has obtained the Titan's Mitt, they're able to meet a frog in the Dark World, and if they escort him to his house and face back to the Light World, they're able to have the Blacksmiths upgrade the Master Sword. What I like about the Buck Boy is that his nature is more mysterious than his demeanor might at first suggest. In game design, it is imperative that the game follows its own rules. Whenever a character breaks those rules, they effectively break the game. We learn early on that the only weapon that can counter Aghanim's magical attacks is the Master Sword, but when fighting him, for some reason, the net given to Link by the Buck Boy can do this as well? I don't mean to insinuate that there's anything to be read into this other than it being a development oversight, but since it made it into the final release, it has to be taken as canonical. Before continuing with the story, I want to discuss Link for a bit. The silent protagonist is a staple of video games and thus has many incarnations. But the few that stand out always do so as they manage to juggle the roles of a blank avatar for the player and as an individual in the world. The trick to designing these is to have the player express themselves as that character. It means designing the gameplay around the character and not vice versa. You want the player to understand who they're playing as simply by having them play as them, and the more you put the player in the character's shoes, the more the character will mean to them. I went over this subject in my System Shock analysis, so I'll be brief and just discuss the Master Sword. The Master Sword is a game changer early on in the game, but only when the player is at full health. This has the player slow down and think methodically through the systems. It rewards immersion. Link cannot do anything out of character in this game except maybe die. But the game doesn't really treat dying as out of character, it treats it as a misstep. Link's progress through the world retains even after death, so the game thinks it's okay to fail. Failure humanizes Link, and this small touch means that the progression of the game doesn't truly facilitate Link acting out of character. And that means that while the player is acting through him, they're also acting as him. So Link gets to have an arc as a character separate from the player, but the player simultaneously gets to write that arc with him. When designing Link for this game, Nintendo used all the best tricks in the book. He has big eyes, which makes it easier to empathize with him. He has a chibi body, which makes him cute and style appropriate. It abstracts him and helps ease the player into accepting the presentation of Link and the world he inhabits. He also has a fitting color scheme. He starts the game wearing very earthy secondary colors, but by the end he's switched to the primary ones. Link as a video game protagonist is practically in a league of his own. He's the icon of the video game hero. His goals are gameplay driven win states, his trials are the players, and his growth is shared with whomever inhabits him. The final maiden rescued from Ganon is Princess Zelda herself. Once he's been freed, the player is ready to take on Ganon, but first they must pass the final ordeal, Ganon's Tower. Had Link not rescued the 7 maidens before reaching it, he'd have been unable to breach it, but since he has their power on his side, the barrier to Ganon's Tower is broken. So Link goes in, ready for whatever may come. What comes is a well-structured dungeon, which includes many of the older bosses being reused as mini-bosses. The ease at which Link defeats them supports the growth he's undergone. But growth alone won't win the fight with Aghanim, so Link must pull out his trusty bug-catching net and proceeds to repel Aghanim's magical attacks. When Link seems to be victorious, Ganon appears, but transforms into a bat and flies away. So Link, having a method of flight himself, plays the flute and chases Ganon to the Pyramid of Power, where upon landing, Ganon broke the floor. A Link to the Past being an adaptation of the hero's journey means that Link must at some point acquire supernatural aid. It comes in the form of fairies who reside in various locations in the land. Throughout the game, finding them has granted Link health and occasionally item upgrades. The most notable of these fairies resides in the Pyramid of Power itself. She enhances Link's weapon and makes them able to harm Ganon. The final boss with Ganon does a good job of characterizing him through combat, as Link must continually ignite torches to be able to harm him. It's a small touch, but it shows the contrast between the two, as Link represents the light and Ganon the dark. When Ganon is defeated, a door opens up and Link goes to have a talk with the essence of the Triforce. It confirms that it has the ability to grant wishes, and that Ganon used it to corrupt the Sacred Realm into the Dark World. I think the last moments really go to show Link as a character, as he takes the Triforce into his hands and makes a wish that the world might be purified of Ganon's influence. We then see a montage of the world after Link's wish. The king returns, the uncle recovers, the Flute Boy reunites with his father, etc. This is a good way of giving some resolution to these stories, and also helps guide the consumption of the additional content for later playthroughs, as the player might not have completed or even found many of these. I wouldn't make a big deal about the credit list itself if it didn't have the most strangely comforting credit of all time. A Link to the Past was created to continue and enhance The Legend of Zelda. To do so, it combined many elements from other notable works of the time, like the art design from JRPGs, the immortal characters from Disney, the screen-spamming blast attacks from the Greatest Likes, etc. The balancing of these influences was masterfully done, and it all rounds up to a game so well sculpted that nothing ever feels out of place. Everything feels very natural, and the game has aged beautifully. If I were to say it's a masterpiece, my compliment might fall as just another drop in the bucket, as this game has already solidified its legacy, so instead I'll urge you to experience it yourself if you haven't already. A Link to the Past is an experience worth going back and having, and if we are to take just one lesson from it going forwards, how about character development through gameplay? The Legend of Zelda series has always been about exploration. So this time, the team used exploration and contextualized it as character development. They did that by rewarding explorers with more heart containers, more powerful items, and an early access to late game items. Much of the exploration is a response to the characters in the game prodding Link along as they make offhand remarks about events in the world, and since the exploration yields better equipment, it effectively makes interacting and attuning with the world itself into a win state. And when it gets to the Dark World, this is really amped up as the interplay between the Light and Dark World is a mechanic unto itself, and Link is stuck right in the middle of it. Link and the player are always harmonized. They always have the same goal, and any expression through Link the player is offered feels realistic and in character. Link's growth is seen in all the small details. He has faster movement as the story progresses. He has additional hit points from immersion-driven exploration, and for every boss he's defeated. Link's growth is directly tied to the player's application of the game's mechanics, and it means that A Link to the Past is a game and a bond that grows more rewarding every time it's revisited. Thanks for watching. In the next video, I'll be discussing a title from the original NES. If you have some suggestions on an NES title you'd like to see covered, be sure to let me know in the comment section below, and if you have some insight on A Link to the Past that you felt I didn't explore, be sure to let me know in the comments as well. Hope to have you aboard for the next episode, and until then, thanks again!